Hi, everyone who's joining us. We're going to start in just a minute. We're just waiting for a few more participants to join us and giving you all time to stream in. Okay, so I think we're going to jump right in because we've got loads of stuff to cover and not that much time today. And participants will continue to join us, hopefully. My name is Aisha Margot, and I'm a technical specialist at the SVRI. I'd like to wish you all a very warm welcome to the session at the 66 CSW, and thank you so much for joining us today. Just before we really jump into it, some quick housekeeping. This event platform is on Zoom webinar. We are being recorded. The webinar recording will be shared with everybody via email and will be uploaded to the SVRI website. All of you, our online participants, are muted for the duration of the event. And for those of you who are with us today, please do feel free to start introducing yourself in the chat and telling us where you all are in the world. The webinar is going to be in English, and translation is available via the Wordly app into 15 different languages. So you will see that in the chat box, a link is going to come up. Please click on that link should you need translation services. And what will happen is another page, another tab will open. On that, do select the language of your choice, and it is going to be in another tab. So we suggest you minimize your boxes so that you can have them alongside each other on the screen and you can watch what's happening and then see the translation as it occurs as well. Okay, great. Next slide, please. We have a great panel today with a wealth of fantastic experience between them, and I am going to introduce each person as we go along. So I won't read out everything right now because it's difficult to have so much information at once. Next slide, please. So during this session, we're going to see 3 short presentations. And they're going to be on the different advocacy resources created by SVRI in dialogue with the field, with the aim of enhancing and increasing funding for research on violence against women and children. This includes a study tracking investment in research on violence against women, a global shared research agenda to guide research and investment, along with a guide for funders on funding ethically. After this, we're going to have a 30-minute panel discussion with all the panelists, and following that, there'll be 15 minutes for questions and further discussion with all the participants. So please, as we go along, do pop your questions in the question box, and if they're directed at a specific panelist, please do mention the name. And do this in the question and answer box if possible, because that way it's a lot easier than keeping track of the chat box. SVRI is the world's largest network on research on violence against women and violence against children. We envisage a world free of violence against women, children, and other forms of violence stemming from gender inequality. We feel very strongly about prevention and response efforts being rooted in research that has been robustly collated and analyzed, and evidence that becomes firmly entrenched in policy, practice, and programs. The SVRI aims to increase and strengthen impactful research and its uptake to improve and expand effective violence prevention and response efforts globally. And we do this by employing innovative strategies and harnessing global energies around 4 key strategic areas. There's building evidence, capacity strengthening, promoting partnerships, and influencing change. All right, so just to sort of give a little bit broader context, what we really want to discuss and think about today is how the tools that you will hear about provide us the opportunity to engage with funders, to highlight inequities, shift power imbalances, and advocate for shifting more resources in better ways to lower and middle income countries and lower and middle income country researchers. While we're speaking about decolonizing, we're really referring to who, what, and how funding is being done from a viewpoint of building inclusion and equity in the field. For SVRI, that means funding that is grounded in feminist principles, that acknowledges and addresses power dynamics, that involves honest, transformative relationships between donors and grantees, and that creates accessible and equitable processes that support priority-driven and impactful research. We know that decolonizing is a huge project, and We're continuing to build understanding on what this implies and what this would mean in terms of shifting funding practice and developing new ways of thinking about funding research in partnership and in community with funders. This is in fact reflected in the participatory consultative processes which took place during the creation of all the tools, and you'll hear much more about that during the presentations. So before we go on to the presentations, I'd just like you all to just take 1 minute and please click on the Mentimeter link in the chat box and just answer in one word. What does decolonizing research mean to you? So just one word, 30 seconds, if you wouldn't all mind doing that. Thank you. And then we're going to look at the results later on in the session. If anyone I'm hoping everyone can see the link. If anyone can't see the link, do put something in the chat and let us know that there's a problem. But hopefully everyone can. All right, 10 more seconds for everyone to put in their word, and then we'll move on. Okay, great. I look forward to seeing all those words later on in the session. So onwards, we're going to go straight into the presentations. First of all, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Dartnell, who will be speaking about the Global Shared Research Agenda. Elizabeth is the Executive Director of SVRI, a health specialist with over 20 years research and policy-making experience on health systems, mental health, violence against women, and violence against children. Having worked in several countries in both government and research positions, Liz has a deep understanding of the policy process and the use of research to inform policy and practice. In South Africa, Liz worked for the Department of Health at both provincial and national levels in epidemiology and health information systems. Over to you, Liz.
Thank you so much, Aisha. Next slide, please, Morma. Next slide, I think again. And again. And again. So we're here to talk about the tools and resources that the field has been developing to really think around how to improve funding for research on violence against women and violence against children in low and middle income countries. And what we started with was developing a global shared research agenda. So the first question is why? Why a global shared research agenda? And the answer really is for too long research agendas, which are really important for funders and all of us in the field to be thinking around what's important for the field, have been set by too few, often the most loudest in the room. And this has meant that the funding may have been misdirected, serving maybe academic researchers' own agendas rather than the communities for whom the research is meant to serve. But to strengthen our understanding of what violence against women is all about, and ultimately to prevent it and how to improve responses for survivors, research has to be priority driven and carried out in a way that provides sound and practical and empirical guidance for interventions, programs, policies, and activists that is relevant and needed. The SVRI, in partnership with the Equality Institute, as well as with support from Wellspring Philanthropic Fund and Swedish Theatre, steered and facilitated the development of a global shared research agenda. And with this agenda, we really are trying to challenge traditional barriers that exist in ways the world is funding research and bringing a more nuanced and equitable way to setting an agenda. Next slide, please, Morma. So why did we do this? What does the Global Shared Research Agenda seek to achieve? We want the Global Shared Research Agenda to identify evidence gaps and really highlight priority areas for research that can guide research expenditure and ensure those really precious research resources are spent more effectively. We want the agenda to assist researchers, funders, practitioners, and policymakers with research planning and fundraising, and to serve as an advocacy tool to signal to stakeholders the areas of research that have been identified as important by the field, and to serve as a monitoring tool for us and the field more broadly, including monitoring actual research and expenditure against priorities. And we're going to talk about how have been trying to track expenditure on research in low middle income countries a little bit later. And of course, we are using the Global Shared Research Agenda to guide our own grant-making efforts. Next slide, please. To do this and to ensure that it was incredibly participatory and co-created, not just by the loudest and the most senior, we created 3 groups. The first group was a stewardship group, which include representatives from the Sexual Violence Research Initiative and the Equality Institute. And this group was tasked with the coordination of the process and overseeing the design, reporting, analysis, and dissemination. And in this group, we had a consultant with expertise in the CHINRI research priority setting process, which is the Child Health Nutrition Research Initiative priority setting process. And we adapted that process for our field and for our needs. We also surrounded ourselves with a group of 30+ experts in violence against women prevention and response fields, and they represented multiple geographic contexts and diverse backgrounds, in highlighting the importance for us of having diversity, equity, inclusion in all steps of the process. And then surrounding that, all of us were surrounded and supported by a global expert group that made up more than 500 people from both low and middle income countries and high income countries working on prevention and response. And this group included practitioners, frontline service providers, Indigenous people, grassroots organisations, peoples with disabilities, LGBTQI+ populations, and culturally and linguistically diverse groups. Next slide, please. So how did we do this? What was the process? We had a very clear but long process. It took us over 2 years to develop the Global Shared Research Agenda. But everything we did was guided by these structures who are rich with diversity and passion for the field. And we developed it through 6 highly participatory processes that were iterative and had plenty of opportunities for feedback from the different governance structures at every step. Next slide, please. So the first step involved a scoping review of the literature. We wanted to see what is currently existing in the literature to identify key gaps, and the literature review was done in multiple languages. And this helped us frame the priority setting process and led to the identification of 4 key domains that the literature was saying where some of the key gaps do lie within the existing literature. Research and understanding violence against women and girls in its multiple forms, intervention research, improving existing interventions and programs, and methodological and measurement gaps. And the advisory group then identified priority research questions under each of these 4 domains via a process that included a number of virtual meetings and online surveys. And they eventually came down to 41 research questions, 10 questions under 3 domains and 11 under one of the other ones. Next slide, please, Morma. These questions were then sent out to the global expert group, which also included the advisory group and the steering group or the driver group. And through online surveys, a series of surveys, ranked and scored each of the questions according to 3 criteria: applicability, effectiveness, and equity. The likelihood that the knowledge generated through the proposed research would be implemented in policy and practice, that the likelihood that the research will produce novel findings that will generate or improve effective and sustainable interventions, and the likelihood that the research findings will lead to interventions that are accessible and equitable to vulnerable groups, or conversely, interventions that could potentially perpetuate inequalities. So who responded? Next slide, please. We received a total of 214 responses, and we had a real widespread response from around the globe, which we were delighted with, of course. And we heard from more practitioners than researchers, which again was super important for us. We did not just want academic voices in this process, we wanted multiple voices. Next slide, please. So what were some of the key gaps? I've only provided you top 5 questions. There are multiple different priorities across different regions and across different constituencies. But what was surprising and interesting is that there really was consistency across all the different groups around the top 5 questions. So the most highly ranked questions fell under domain 2, intervention research, suggesting that intervention research is viewed by the field as what is most needed at this point. It does not mean that other types of research is not important, but this is where the field is saying investment is really needed. And the top one was, what type of interventions can effectively prevent multiple forms of violence and why? What type of interventions are most effective for preventing intimate partner violence against women facing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, including age, poverty, disability, ethnicity, race, and sexuality? And how are social movements, including both feminist movements, but what we made up a term called meninist movements, but a movement, anti-feminist movements or men's rights activists or incels, for example. How do these different types of movements positively or negatively influence individual social and political perspectives related to the experience and perpetration of violence? And what type of interventions work to prevent sexual harassment in institutional settings, in person or online, including the workplace and educational settings, and why? There are lots of questions around why, trying to understand the mechanisms and what is important about these interventions that are influencing change. And then the 5th top one, what are the impacts, including disability-related impacts of under-researched forms of IPV, intimate partner violence on women and girls, including emotional and economic IPV, revenge porn, and honor-based violence. Next slide, please. So what did we learn? I think you just need to click again more. Some lessons for us moving forward. And for those of you considering adapting the approach for your own settings, and I would suggest you do, it's really been a wonderfully important and very rich process. We learned, one of our first lessons we learned was that the advisory group and the global expert groups were essential and important throughout the process, as we had developed a network of people committed to making this process work. And what really then is the lesson is that if you're to do this again, and we are doing it again, is that we need to develop and actively use our own networks to promote the agenda, and that those advisory groups are essential to be actively promoting the agenda and engagement and participation in the process. And what I've highlighted previously is where we wanted as many diverse voices involved in the process. So then an important second lesson is to really closely monitor the results as they're coming in real time, so you can address any gaps in the responses in real time and reach out to the groups of people that you want to make sure are included in the process, do actively engage in the process. And for us, of course, was online. Many practitioners were overwhelmed, exhausted, and highly unlikely to have the time or the energy to complete an online long, complex questionnaire. So we really did try to ensure.
Liz, we're losing you a little bit. Oh, I think we in fact have lost Liz entirely. Let's just give Liz 1 minute to come back and just finish this. And if she doesn't pop back in a minute, Angelica, we'll just move on to you. Okay. Let's just give her. I'm sure she'll reconnect in the next few seconds. Okay, I think maybe we should move on because there might be something that'll take a while. Angelica, are you happy? Are you happy to start now?
Yes,
okay,
can,
brilliant.
yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna just introduce you to, and I mean, when Liz gets back on, then she can just wrap up the last bits that she was gonna say. So without further ado, Angelica Pino, I'm gonna ask you to present the SVRI funding equity guidance. Angelica is the grants manager and capacity strengthening specialist at SVRI. She's a feminist lawyer with extensive experience in gender-based violence and gender equality. Through the SVRI and partners, she hopes to contribute to gender justice by facilitating the access to resources and building the capacity of gender-based violence researchers from the Global South, as well as stimulating networking among researchers. Over to you, Angelica. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aisha. So I'm now going to share with you the result of a second project implemented by the SVRI to promote ethical funding in the field. And the Funding Ethically project aimed to address the complex issues around resources and power dynamics between donors and funders and funded projects, and develop guidance for funders on ethical and coordinated funding for research on violence against women and violence against children in low and middle income countries. Next slide, please. But first, I think I would like to share with you a quote from one of the interviewees in the project, a researcher from Latin America. And this researcher said, donors need to fund research that meets real needs and does not arise from contexts that are far from reality. Decolonize the approaches of this type of generation of knowledge and practices. Stop seeing low and middle income countries as laboratories for the production of knowledge. Become true allies and impact people to counter the neoliberal colonial system. And to me, I think this quote encapsulates vividly the concerns we have about how knowledge in our field is produced, and also pushes us to think about research not just as a technical skill that one individual has, but as a deeply political process, particularly in the Global South. Next slide, please. Thank you, Morna. So, the key objective of this project was to create guidance in consultation with funders, researchers, and practitioners that could contribute to better funding for research on violence against women and violence against children in low and middle income countries. So what did we mean by better funding? In some ways, the whole point of the project was to find that out in consultation with the field. But of course, we had some ideas of our own. How could it look? What are the possibilities? So we thought of funding that is grounded in feminist principles, acknowledges and addresses power dynamics, involves honest, transformative relationship between donors and grantees, and creates accessible and equitable processes that support low and middle income country researchers. So our specific objectives with this project were to reframe the collaboration between donors and funders, promote equitable funding in the field, advocate for more and smarter funding in our field, advocate for more research funding in low and middle income countries, and develop the ethical funding guidelines. Next slide, please. So how was this done? The process was very important. As Liz mentioned, the process is as important as the end. And we used multiple complementary methods, a scoping review to look at existing guidance. We ran several processes, 7 focus group discussions, 2 with funders from the very different types of funding organizations, 23 with researchers, and 2 with practitioners. We also had an online survey that stayed online for a full month, and wherein over 70% of respondents were researchers and practitioners working in low middle income countries. An advisory group constituted right at the start provided guidance and strategic oversight throughout the process. Next slide, please. So out of this rich process, we arrived to recommended approaches and principles for funding ethically, which we are very proud to share with you today. Based on learnings from the own SVRI's grant-making program, a core value for the grant guidance is that it is important that violence against women and violence against children research be informed by feminist praxis, so that the research process centralize the experiences and voices of research participants, ensuring that programming in the field is based on lived experiences, desires, and priorities of women and children. 4 France discussions around complex and unequal power relations, funders, researchers, practitioners, and activists, and the complexities therein, and this empowers research participants as co-producers of knowledge. And finally, highlights the need to use creative ways and alternative methodologies and approaches that are designed to include the most vulnerable and least visible communities. Next slide, please. So, what are the principles that we arrived to after this process? First of all, though, to note that although our specific guidance is for research, the principles that are highlighted are relevant for donors funding programmatic interventions as well. And we do hope that it will be useful for a range of donors. So, which are the principles we are proposing? First of all, decolonizing knowledge and method of learning. We need to rethink the questions of what constitutes evidence and expertise, how knowledge is created, whose voices are heard, and whose data counts. Secondly, creating equity in research partnerships. And this comes up from multiple perspectives, including localization, diversity and inclusion, and research translation, authorship, and dissemination. Key issues or action points for funders related to this principle includes involvement of local researchers and implementing partners from the beginning of the research process as co-producers of knowledge, and ensuring that agreements related to authorships, presentation of work are made early and are fair and inclusive. And then we have another principle, ensuring funding is flexible, adaptive, and long-term, where possible, and restricted funding. This is a good example of a principle that is relevant not just for research, but in different contexts as well. Funding women's rights organizations to do their work and funding resilience and sustainability. Because it considers how donors can include money for core costs and overheads that allows organizations to focus on their core work rather than on constant fundraising, chasing the money basically. For researchers and implementing partners in low and middle income countries, flexibility within existing funding and programmatic arrangements is critical to allow partners to adapt their projects, services, and activities to the changing context and the circumstances that might arise. These things constantly happen in the labs of research projects, but COVID, of course, was a very obvious example of what can happen externally. This leads us perfectly onwards to the fourth principle, transform the funder-grantee relationship. This encourages an affirmative approach that emphasizes that both parties have the same objective of really wanting the project to end well, to succeed in a trust-based partnership. So we need to rethink what it means to be the one that gives the money, offering no financial support, transparent and open communication, simplification of the process. Next slide, please. So, sorry, one up. Sorry, Norma, one up. Hello. That's the one. Thank you. So, some examples of how to put these principles into action. And we try as much as we can to implement this really. We really make big efforts at SVRI grant making program to do this. Recall, so key recommendation is that what is going on in that field, existing literature and local communities have identified as research priorities and developing a deep understanding of the local context within which the call must be disseminated. During the call, include creating and reviewing the RFP, bearing in mind issues related to increasing the diversity of the applicants pool. Third step, the application. Include setting specific priorities so that they are accounted for by researchers in proposals. For example, include budget items that address issues of partnership development, of research uptake, capacity sharing, and dissemination of these research products so that they don't end up just in the shelves or in academic publications. In the due diligence process and review of applications, ensure diversity and local expertise on the review committees, as well as an approach that emphasizes flexibility, negotiation, and collaboration among the consortium members. In the post-award develop a shared understanding. So we really try to talk to our partners, develop a partnership based on trust and open communication. Implementation process. Include support for the amplifying the work of your grantees. try to adjust when you can, if things go wrong, which things go wrong many times. So put a trust-based partnership into practice. And in this part too, really we try to really share the work of our grantees. We invite them to all kind of activities. So it's not just about working a little trade, you open a world of possibilities for the grantees and share their work with the world. And last but not least, when you close the project, is consider transitioning funding that would enable grantees to conduct advocacy based on the research findings, reinforce the linkages made throughout the project, and be flexible regarding reporting requirements and deadlines if necessary. Next slide, please. What is then now, what is the call for action from our side in relation to this a particular component of our work? We will continue disseminating the guidance. We invite you to learn about it and use it in the organ making program. Come to talk to us. We will be happy to share our experience and also assist you in rethinking your organ making program to make it more ethical and in the end geared towards making an impact in the lives of women and children experiencing violence. Thanks so much, Aisha.
Thank you so much, Angelica, and thank you for jumping in a little bit earlier than you might have expected to. Just to pause, Liz, we're so sorry we lost you right at the end of your presentation there, but would you like to quickly round up or make final comments on the GSRA now?
That would be really wonderful. A big call to action is that what is most important about the GSRA process is that there are still major research gaps in the VAW field, but to be effective, it has to be used. And funders really, we want you to increase your investment in high quality and ethical research aligned with the GSRA. Researchers, we really want you to use the GSRA to inform your own research agendas. And practitioners, we want you to use the agenda as a guide for partnerships with researchers on the evaluation of your interventions. And we want all of us to be using this as a tool to advocate for more and better research funding that addresses the critical gaps that the field have identified as important. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much, Aisha, for letting me have a little bit of a last word.
No, absolutely. We were sorry to lose you at that critical cliff edge point. But, glad we could get back so quickly. Okay, brilliant. And now we are going to move on to our final presentation before the panel discussion. And it is Joy Watson is going to talk about the tracking funding report. We're extra excited right now about this because this is a sort of premiere for this report. It's the first time it's being discussed publicly launched. We'll be sharing the links in the chat. And as you'll see, we have been sharing links all along, but just quickly to mention, we will also be sending out links of this webinar recording, which will be on an SVRI webpage, and all the useful links will also be available there for everyone later on. And we'll be sending this out to all the panelists, all the audience here today. So Joy, over to you. Joy is a feminist researcher with over 20 years of experience in feminist activism. Her research areas of specialization include women in politics, women in governance, violence against women, and analyzing public policy and expenditure from a feminist perspective. She's the co-author of a book called Rupturing the Norms, the Social and Political Response to the Rape of Anine Boyson. Over to you, Joy, and thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. So thank you to the participants who joined, and I'm very excited to say that when you click on the link to the tracking funding study, you are the very first people outside of this group to take a look at this study itself. So we look forward to hearing from you what you think and engaging further with you on it. So while Liz talked to what are the research gaps, what should we be looking at in terms of research questions, and Angelica talked about how should we fund, what is the blueprint idealistically for funding to take place. The tool that I'm talking to looks at how we track money in terms of following the funding flow to research on violence against women in low and middle income countries. We can move to the next slide, please, Norma. To preface this by saying that this was a mammoth task. It was very difficult to do, and I'll talk to some of those challenges. luckily, maybe I should just point out that the study that Angelica spoke to was a separate study, but it was very interesting that in developing that blueprint, there were very similar findings to the tracking funding flows study. So I won't go into too much detail in terms of terrain that Angelica has already covered so that we have more time for the discussion session. So what we tried to do very quickly was 4 things: to look at how much money there is for research on violence against women, to look at where that money comes from, thirdly, to look at who and what determines the research priorities, and then lastly, to look at how research is actually used to prevent and address violence against women. Next slide, please, Wilma. The research methods, we used 3 key methods. First, an analysis of the OECD database, and specifically there we looked at purpose code 15180, which is the purpose code where donors log projects that pertain to ending violence against women. But because sometimes projects are lodged elsewhere, we also did a keyword search relating to GBV and research to extend that search a little bit. Then we did an online survey with both funders and grantees, and we had 13 funders and 47 grant recipients in total. So not a big sample, but it did provide some interesting information into perspectives of funders and grant recipients on funding flows to research. And then we also looked at 4 case study countries: Colombia, PNG, South Africa, and Lebanon. And here we did 10 interviews with key informants in each country, a total of 40. And they comprised of both funders as well as grant recipients, trying to understand how much money was going to research on violence against women. I might just mention there, I think, it's just to very quickly say that in terms of some of the limitations of this, not all of the major donor countries have taken up the use of purpose code 15180. There's also not consistency in terms of publishers' data practices. So there are limitations in terms of what we were able to extrapolate from in terms of findings, but nonetheless, it was a useful starting point. I think, also to just say that very importantly, and the single biggest thing that this study showed us, that both the case studies and the online survey, we had key informants and respondents to the survey really struggling with trying to get to a dollar's amount of how much money was going to research. And this is largely because research is often embedded within broader program activity. So program for violence against women, program activities, it's very hard to delineate, and that proved to be a stumbling block that we really grappled with. Next slide, please, Norma. So in terms of the findings, what the OECD database showed us was that in 2019, a total of 1.365 billion USD went to violence against women. And of this, an estimated 0.05% of total ODA went to research. That the USD amount is 76, close to 77 million. So that's not, while it's an imperfect measure in terms of the limitations of the use of the database, it seems to signify that funding going to research on violence against women is disproportionately low in terms of the scale of the problem. When we looked at who is funding, we found that it was mainly high-income countries, and very interestingly enough, only a small number of donors. The interviews with, in the case study countries showed us that very little to no funding was coming from national governments. And even in all of these 4 case study countries, we had national action plans where research was identified as being a priority. Notwithstanding this, very little to no money was going to research. Then in terms of who was getting the money, from the survey, as well as the key informant interviews, we saw that it went to a range of organizations. Most common was national women's rights organizations, NGOs, research and academic institutions. For the research and academic institutions, it was a little bit different. They found it a little easier to give us a monetary value because that money is just for research, but then for other key informants, it was a lot harder. When we look at what research is being funded, the survey responses showed us a range of focus areas, but mostly funding was going to preventing violence against women. And then we're on to the next slide. We're skipping happily along here. So I just want to quickly go through the 4 key recommendations to emerge. Number 1 was to develop a baseline of funding flows to research and violence against women, because as I said earlier, this information, quite frankly, just doesn't exist. It's not readily available. So that's the single biggest entry point and where we need to focus advocacy efforts. So that is going to be the starting point in terms of taking some of this work forward. The second key area was ensuring that research for violence against women is decolonized, localized, and promotes diversity. And so really to put under the lens the balance of power between donors, researchers, and most importantly, the communities where those being researched and the communities who are meant to benefit from the research to keep the power dynamics in sight there. Thirdly, to fund the dissemination of research and initiatives pertaining to its uptake. And this might sound fairly obvious, but from the interviews, we found that often that there wasn't resources allocated or not sufficient resources allocated to ensuring that the work, particularly of low and middle income country researchers, is disseminated and put on platforms where they are amplified and people have access. But importantly here is the link between knowledge generation and action, that there has to be an investment ensuring that research is translated into action. And then lastly, our last recommendation was to just reinforce that everything that was found in the study that looked at ethical funding, that blueprint seems to be pointing us in the right direction, and it is a solid plan of action in terms of how to fund better. Very quickly, and I promise you, I'm going to speed talk through this. I just wanted to say that there were a few challenges that emerged from the study in terms of funding research in low and middle income countries. The first was that it's very hard to do research in humanitarian and development settings, where key informants noted that peace and post-conflict agenda captures the maximum political interest and financial resources, which ultimately leads to a deprioritization of research on violence against women. Secondly, what came through so strongly was who defines the research questions. And in the survey, it was interesting to see that there was a big discrepancy between the views of donors and that of grant recipients. Grant recipients felt very strongly that donors were the ones who defined research questions. And this came through again in the case study interviews. The fact that research is embedded within other projects was another challenge in terms of trying to follow money flows, diversity and equity. And here, this emerges an issue in 2 key ways. The first is the inequity in allocating funding and granting opportunities in general to researchers from low and middle income countries when compared to those from high income countries. And the second issue being that there is inequity in investing in the capacity of practice-based knowledge practitioners when compared to researchers working in academic settings. So room to improve the capacity building there from a funding perspective. And then very lastly, the issue of grant lengths came up time and time again, that most key informants felt that grants were very short-term in nature, ranging from 4 months to at most 3 years, but on average around a year to a year and a half. And there were relatively few opportunities for longer-term grants and for longitudinal studies. Sorry for the mouth twist there. And then I'm going to end by going to the next slide and just saying, and these are not definitive next steps. These are some ideas. that I've just put on the table. You may have more and we'd be keen to engage with that. What is clear is that we need spaces where we have sitting around the table, donors, researchers, knowledge-based practitioners, to look at how funding approaches can be fundamentally transformed. Secondly, the need for the ongoing monitoring of funding going to research. And we can't monitor without a baseline, so that baseline is critical. And then very importantly, to end by saying that, national governments fell short, and, these are national governments in low and middle income countries, in allocating money to research on violence against women. And we need to make sure that where there are national action plans, that there's a concomitant link with money going to research. I think that, one of the things that, and I promise I'm stopping here, one of the things that came out very, very strongly was that there's a political rhetoric and talk of money must go to violence against women, but when you actually follow that money in practice, it's a whole different story. Aisha, thank you for indulging. I'm going to stop.
Thank you so much, Joy. That was great. Thank you very much. So much information. I know that everyone's had to think about and listen to in this last half an hour. We think great resources that we really hope are going to contribute to the field. Yeah, and we hope you've enjoyed listening to this. And as I said, the links are all available. Just to give us a minute to take a breath before the panel discussion, we're going to quickly take a look at the word cloud from the Mentimeter question that we did at the start, and then just see what has come up. Moma, are you able to share that screen right now? If not, we can just move on.
Yes, I'm gonna try.
Great, thank you. Okay. Wow, lots and lots of words. So accountability, Southern-led research, equality, equity, fairness, intentionality, representation, Indigenous knowledge, participatory, power to the South, diversity, Indigenous perspectives, challenging assumptions. So all the things I think that we, are all trying to talk about consistently when we talk about the issue of decolonization, and when we've been talking about all of these resources. And what I'd like to do now is for us to move on and actually discuss some of these ideas more with our panel. We have two more members of the panel who are joining us, and I would like to introduce them to you before I begin. So Modoni Muriti, she's the co-director for the Accelerator for Gender-Based Violence Prevention, and she is a Pan-African feminist, gender justice advocate, and human rights lawyer and campaigner, with over 18 years of experience advocating for gender equality, including addressing gender-based violence. Until recently, Modoni worked as Senior Gender Policy Manager at the World Wide Web Foundation, where she led the foundation's gender-focused policy development and advocacy on closing the gender digital divide, including addressing online gender-based violence. So very warm welcome to you, Modoni. And one more panelist, and I'm saying it last, but not at all least, Tesma, is Tesmerelna Atsveha, a Senior Program Officer at the Wellspring Philanthropic Fund. Tesmerelna's previous experiences include working at UN Women in the Health and HIV/AIDS Unit and at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health as part of the International AIDS Care and Treatment Program. She's also worked in Africa and Latin America on sexual and reproductive health research and implementation projects with UNDP, the Global Fund, and several academic institutions. So now that we all know everyone, let's jump right in. And I just want to ask all our panelists, are you comfortable? Are you ready? Is everybody ready to go? Okay, great. All right. So Liz, first question is to you. And don't let your electricity go off again. so
holding thumbs.
Yeah, holding thumbs. How do you think all of these tools come together to help us to advocate for more and better resources for research on violence against women and violence against children in lower and middle income countries?
Thank you, Aisha, for your complex and difficult question. But as mentioned throughout these presentations, I think what's really coming through, one of the strong messages that funding for research on violence against women and violence against children still is concentrated in high-income countries. And I think what Joy's been highlighting in the tracking funding, as well as the ethical funding guide and the global shared research agenda, the discussions that we've been having, more resources need to be allocated towards research led and undertaken by researchers and practitioners in lower middle income countries. And this is really to ensure that the research does inform the creation of more effective, locally relevant and contextually appropriate response and prevention programs. And really in response to the need for more advocacy around this and how to achieve this and how to fund research in a way that is grounded in feminist principles, these resources are really a signal or a way sign for who is funding research, in which ways that needs to change or can be strengthened, what research is important to the field to be funding, and those messages need to be reaching the folk who are funding the research, and how to fund research in a way that really promotes equity, diversity, and inclusion. And those words are really important, even though we keep saying them. I think the more we say them, the more I hope they highlight how important they are to us. And I think these resources really assist us all in knowledge building, in the knowledge building ecosystem, to really openly name and address the power dynamics that do exist. They help us to have really honest and transformative conversations and to transform the relationships between donors and grantees and others, and create more accessible and equitable processes that do support priority-driven research in lower middle-income countries led by lower middle-income country researchers. Thank you, Aisha, back to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Liz. So I think, actually moving directly on from there and connected to exactly what you've been talking about is, so yes, there are these great tools available. We're very optimistic about how they might be used, but ensuring that they can be used is challenging, not just with SVRI's work, but with many organizations. And Tesma, I'd like to pose this question to you. I mean, how would you suggest that we get these tools to be utilized or better utilized by funders and policymakers? What ideas are out there?
Thanks, Aisha, for this question, and thank you to Liz and Angelica and Joy for putting together this wonderful session, and for all of the friendly names I see in the participants who are here to have the conversation with us. There's so much to be said, and I know that we've already, like, having all these feminists together with excitement is already, there's so much that's been shared. So, trying to take a pause to absorb and digest everything. I think first I wanted to be sure that we're connecting with the purpose and, thinking about how these tools connect with purpose, and that ultimately we're looking to increase knowledge of what works to prevent violence against women and girls and gender-based violence. And that that would be translated into evidence-based programming and policies, and that we then could, increase the resources and scale up that programming and ultimately decrease violence. That, and sort of like putting that in the picture. And tools are really important. They as Liz said, they're signposts, but we really need our processes, and we really need intentionality with those processes, because we're talking about systems change, we're talking about culture change, and institutions, that are very big, in some cases, very big ships that take a long time to change direction, right? It takes a lot of work to shift, and decision makers and policymakers need support to be able to understand evidence and to have spaces for that learning. The SVRI Forum is a really good space for that, just as a plug, and hopefully any funders or policymakers on this session will consider attending, because that is a great space for that learning. Also support to link the evidence and the evidence building to institutional priorities and to strategies, because that's an important way for, that's like how, as funders, we need to be able to do that linkage work, and that's a big part of our role. And then to have spaces for dialogue to really make meaning out of it and understand it. And I think that's something we miss sometimes, is that, like, decision makers are folks too that have limited bandwidth and might not be able to become researchers, but need to be able to understand the evidence. as I said, the spaces for connection and dialogue and meaning making are really important. And it's a part of movement building. And I think it's another thing to think about the role of researchers in movement building. And that's something that we often don't talk about, and I think is well understood, in feminist movements, that there's a role for those who are building the evidence, but it's not often highlighted. And I think it's an area that we want to increase. And I think it's been highlighted in a couple of the pieces. I think the other important point is just around further contextualization and further localization and further, as I used to say about the SDGs, domestication, but really breaking down the shared agenda and these funding principles, or these guidelines for funding, into more specificity for specific situations. So when you're talking about regional work, and I know that's the next stage with the shared research agenda, which is really exciting because it's really the community from a region coming together and making meaning and building priorities out. As well, I think, for specific marginalized populations or in specific settings, it's really important for us to understand what this means and how it can be applied in those settings. And then I think that, like, lifting up and elevating really good models of what does work, because folks need that. They need to see the model. So models of, what does collaborative research look like? What do those practices look like in the real world? And I think the data equity framework gives us some important pieces for that. And hopefully those folks that are, starting that process of building that into their institutions would be some great examples. But we have a couple of I think the EVE project in Peru is one that's been, analyzed and understood. I think also thinking about what are the models for funding. And I know that the COFIM guidance and other guidance has, presents some models for what equitable, inclusive, and participatory funding there is out there. And there's also some good global level models of where that's happened, mostly from the feminist movements, because we're always, I think, led by our sisters in the feminist movements funding ecosystem. And finally, just for models for collaborative policy making and implementation. And, I think this is good that, Mithoni's here, because that's the next sort of stage. And that's where I think as a community, we are ready to dig deeper and build that out. But we've seen, the accelerator, which we'll talk about, is a model for, building out the accountability framework from generation equality, thinking about the national level models like the National Dialogue Framework in South Africa, which is basically a space where policymakers and researchers sit together and try to understand the evidence together. And that is what the basis for them building policy together. And then the whole of government approach, which is, coming based on the model in Australia, and the learning that's happened now with Ministry of Gender folks in Peru to learn more and build that out. So I think there's some great models out there. And this is, I think, just the beginning of the conversation. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tesma. I think loads of information there and some really great and very important points, and very connected to where we're going next. And Mithoni, I'd like to direct this question to you, which is, again, a little bit around how these tools and research inform then strategic advocacy for increased investment in evidence-based and practice-informed programs and policies on preventing gender-based violence. And what do you think about this?
Thank you so much, Aisha. And can I just say, well done. Congratulations for all the work that you've all done. It's really so mind-blowing just to see the depth of work, and so informative. I'll just start off by perhaps maybe sharing a bit about what the Accelerator for Gender-Based Violence Prevention is, because I can understand not many people might know what that is. So this is a newly established initiative that is aimed at driving a multi-stakeholder shared advocacy agenda, what Tesma has kind of touched on. And this calls for more and better funding and policy to prevent gender-based violence. The shared agenda provides a platform to advance various stakeholders. So we're talking about governments, donors, civil society organizations, the commitments majoring generation equality and beyond. So it's not only limited to generation equality, just to be sure, but also create a community of practice for those in the GBV prevention field. So what we are aiming to do with this new initiative is really be an advocacy accelerator for GBV prevention, and coordinate working with the GBV prevention community to develop very clear and unified advocacy messages on the need for more and better investment on GBV prevention. And I've just seen a message, a question from Fabio. So I think to Fabio, in trying to answer the question around what advocacy could look like, I will try to answer that in my presentation. So I hope this will cover your question. But for us, the shared advocacy agenda is a call to action. And precisely what we want is increased direct investment in evidence-based programming and policies, precisely at least $500 million of new money by 2026. As well as we want to advocate for more countries, especially thinking of national governments, as I think you had mentioned, Joy, about 50% of national governments making commitments to fund, in addition to international assistance, GBV prevention and programming. And I think this is important. And I think your research has really highlighted where the gaps in funding, especially at national level, where those gaps in funding are. And I think this is why these tools are really important for us as the accelerator. But I just want to share, what do we mean by more and better? Because I can understand these words we don't have all the same understanding. So when we say we want more funding, what we mean to say is that we want new funders directly supporting violence prevention programming, and that the current funders are investing in upscaling or substantially larger scale prevention work when we talk about more. And we talk about better, and I think this is also tied to the conversation around ensuring that we apply principles, as we're calling them, principles around decolonizing research. Better includes resourcing in forms that are accessible to women's rights organizations and movements and funds that prioritize the voices of the most marginalized. We want to ensure that better also means that funding is going to evidence-based and practice-informed policies and programs that we know prevent violence, right? So we want to make sure that the money is going to the areas where it is most needed. And for us at the Accelerator, we see ethical research as part of the larger comprehensive approach to ending gender-based violence, because the processes and the practices that support social change, as we know, are complex, and that we need very nuanced understanding of what works, especially when this is identified by those who are most impacted by GBV and the communities themselves. We also know that we need ethical and transformative research practices to identify key advocacy priorities for us as the shared advocacy agenda. We want to make sure that we are right on the point. We want to make sure that we're advocating for what works, what is needed, both at the community level, but at the national level, at regional level, and at global level. We need to be able to point out where the need is, where we need more and better funding for GBV programming, where there's a need to scale up, where donors, governments, bilaterals, multilaterals can best support GBV prevention. And we need to make sure that this work is really taking into consideration the complexity of social change, especially in helping us understand those contextual complexities, right? So the research really helps us understand how this work looks like in different areas, but also emphasizes a need to invest and support local knowledge production, invest in local solutions for social change, while investing in women's organizations and community organizations who are change makers in their community. So basically, this has to be a holistic approach. It can't be, one size fits approach. It cannot be investing in only one area, but really working with the whole community, the GBV community, to make sure that we have a collective shared advocacy agenda towards increasing investment in GBV prevention. as Tesma has already pointed out, I think the good news is that we've already seen some of these research programs. For example, if we think of what works, it's given us some solid basis for our advocacy. So for example, some of the key advocacy messages that we want to really share is make sure that we all understand that prevention of GBV is possible. We've seen that it's possible, and we need to keep on hammering that message that this is possible and that investments can go towards this objective. We also want to ensure that we make clear messages around that we can reduce perpetration and victimization with the right policies and the right programs if done right. So the research needs to help us identify what those right policies are, the right programs, and what does impact look like, and how can that be scaled up. We also know that research has told us that this can be done in a relatively short time, and that there are different programmatic timeframes, right? So the evidence is there, the research is there. I think the question of translation, how we translate the existing research that has already been done into clear advocacy messaging is the work that we as the accelerator will be aiming to do with the community, to make sure that, as we pointed out, that policymakers really understand what the research is saying and what is needed. So for us, we see the global research agenda, and especially the tracking tool, as very useful and informative, especially in pointing to where that funding for GBV prevention should be going, where it's actually going at this time, and where those gaps are. And for us, it's taking that information and ensuring that we advocate for filling those gaps and making sure that those resources are going where they need to be. I think the ethical funding guidance is great because it does provide for us really foundational principles and tips which we need to convey to donors and governments in terms of how to invest in such work. And we see this as being very complementary to the work of the accelerator in informing our advocacy and tracking where those resources are going. It's also tied in with some of our own principles, which I think we share with you. And for us at the accelerator, we have a few things that guide us. So it's ensuring that the work that we're doing is additive and valuable to the ongoing movement to end gender-based violence. We want to take a feminist approach, ensuring that there are diverse voices that are being heard, that transformative gender equality is at the center of the work that we're doing. We want to make sure that we are centering the perspectives and leadership of global South leadership. Want to also focus on adding to and not duplicating on existing initiatives, especially if we're thinking about generation equality, and how we monitor the commitments that have been taken up, and how we support the movements in tracking where those resources are going, and making sure that we're engaging different stakeholders, including governments, international institutions, women's rights organizations, that all voices are heard in strengthening the work towards prevention. So basically, we see this work as really adding to the advocacy piece of prevention. And we do really look forward to seeing how we can continue working to develop and sharpen those messages, and making sure that the research itself is translated and is landing where it should be. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Madhoni. So I'm actually just going to shift, because what you've said is actually connected to another question that in fact I had for you, Tesma, which is, looking at all the stuff around what works. How do we know what works around the different aspects, for instance, like knowledge building, language justice, including a data equity framework within our work? And can you comment? I mean, we have another 5 or 6 minutes for this discussion before we open for questions, but love to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, I think it's really great what Madhoni has lifted up on thinking about accountability frameworks, and how we're developing those and having better systems of understanding what is actually having an impact, or what is actually being used. I think, as I mentioned as well, another important piece is those when we talk about interstitial or something, spaces, which I think is a funny word, but those spaces in between, I think those strengthening of those bonds across the community and having those dialogue spaces, and that builds trust. And I think that's an important part of knowing what works. And it's that's not an easy thing to measure, but I think the level of connectedness in our field and in our community is an important part, and that will help us know what works. I think that this is a difficult question in the sense that there's different approaches to thinking about this, and I think when we were part of the broader group thinking about what why do we need more advocacy and why do we need more visibility for this, we really had some deep discussions of like, what does that look like? And we looked at some of the different models in the field. It was interesting because what we came to was that we don't have a community where you can do top-down type of work where you can, here's the guidance, now everyone do what I say. It really has to kind of come from the different spaces and really allow the spaces for growth and for sparking of conversation and sparking of collaborations in a much more organic way. As we say in the funding world, let many flowers bloom. And I think that that's something that's really important, that we're thinking about this in many different ways, almost like micro strategies. There are so many different components for what is an overall decolonization frame. And so, we did a field engagement exercise for our own strategic planning, and we came out with 9 different areas. And I have them listed, and I was thinking, people really want to know, but like some of the ones that we really haven't had a chance to dig into, relate to like challenging evidence hierarchies, Southern epistemologies, thinking about language justice more deeply, thinking about mapping of power dynamics, thinking about leadership and pipeline development and supportive mentorship, which is part of movement building, thinking about diversity in decision-making panels. And that I think is something that SVRI has been really thoughtful about with the forum and also in the research review processes. Thinking about data equity practices, which I think is a whole other webinar we can do that, getting into that. And then spaces for healing and trauma work and for healing justice, I think is another area. So this is just, I think that this is really pointing us into the growth of so many different new areas. And there's a space for everyone to engage. And that I think is the key thing of like, your thing might not be data equity, it might not be funding, ethical funding practices, it might not be the agenda. There are so many different spaces, and I think it's just, trying to encourage folks to take a look at these resources and see where their work really fits in and where the entry point for that work is.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. You're absolutely right. We actually need another hour and a half, but not right now. Don't worry, everybody, don't panic. But Angelica and Joy, you're not escaping my question. I'm just going to ask you to maybe give one example rather than 3. But I just wanted to really ask you before we open it up for questions. Angelica, what practices do you think can build trust between funders and grantees? And do you have like an example from your own practice as a funder, that you could share with us right now?
Thanks so much, Aisha. Well, I think talking from my experience from work, I've been working in the past in the organizations, I've been working in women's rights organizations and quite big NGOs receiving funding. I think there are small things one can do actually, but I want to share today with the audience, the SVRI experience as a grant maker. We are sort of clearing house in a way for funds for research on violence against women in the South. And I think a clear example of how you can do things differently was with the COVID situation. So everything got, and everyone knows, everything got derailed, put it that way. And what we did was a really concerted effort to understand what was happening with our grantees. And they're all living and in very in places with kind of quite challenging situations, more than in some other places, I would say. So what we did was we were quite flexible, I would say, and trustful. I think that's a word that is very key, flexibility and trust, basically. Yeah. So first of all, openness of communication without burdening them, obviously. We extended the contract periods. We had, I think most of our grantees got no cost extension in the last 2 years, I would say, or so. Also, we negotiated project activities so that they could fit in the whole idea of the research. We accommodated some of the kind of outcomes, the expected outcomes of this, what we were looking for. So I think some of the projects in Latin America and Asia end up looking a bit different to the original idea, but we thought, we are trusting you in terms of what's going on in your context, how are you analyzing what it can be done or not. So I think those were kind of vague, good examples of how you can really try to follow the lead from your partners and based in trust. So we try to, in terms of how we do right now, due diligence processes and all that, how we arrive to the contractual partnerships. We try to be also, again, very flexible, not to overburden people with administrative requirements, really giving them the time, the resources to focus on what's important. It's the research they are conducting, or in the case of, for instance, people doing program, continuous funding program, focus on what the people need to deliver the best work that is really going to change the situation of women and children on the ground. So don't be obsessed with your ticking list of, like of your fantastic kind of log frames and all that, because that's not, might help sometimes, but in the end, that's not what the partner should be doing. That's not, people shouldn't be worrying about that, basically. So that's kind of in the nutshell, the way we have been trying to do our grant making: trust and flexibility.
Great, thank you very much, Angelica. And final question, Joy, I'm sending to you. So the tracking funding work, which you've told us amazingly about, really highlighted the need for an overhaul of how funding for research is monitored and tracked. And can you share maybe just one example for us of where the funding has been done really well and why you think that?
I'm going to go through it very quickly. Really, I think it centers around consultation. And from that very pivotal moment of deciding what is the research question, what are the research gaps, and the respect and the trust that local and Indigenous people know what their knowledge gaps are. They know what their service delivery needs are and what the knowledge needs to be produced in order to get that service delivery. And when we talk about decolonizing research from a funding perspective, it's for funders to really think through that participatory model from the pivotal point of deciding what gets studied. I'm going to stop there. There's so much I want to say, but it's not my party. So
I'm sorry. I feel terrible. Okay. Thank you all so much. This has been a great discussion, and I think we do have some questions from our audience, and I'm just going to look into the question box. And what I'm going to do, unless the question specifically says who they want to answer, I'm going to leave it up to you all to jump in if there's something you specifically want to say about something. So we have a question from Lindsay, who says, I'm interested to learn more about what you found out about the types of research methods used and the implications for the ability to decolonize categories and concepts largely developed in the global north, which may not resonate in many contexts. Joy, you had to give a very short answer. Do you want to jump in here?
So maybe just to say that, in terms of the key informant interviews, that did come through quite strongly. That firstly, money flows largely from high income countries from the global north, and that the vast majority of key informants and in the survey were very clear that while they felt a sense of ownership of their research work and that there was room for them to input into the research methods, they did not set the agenda in terms of what was studied. And if I think, I stand to be corrected, but if I think out of 40 interviews, I can recall 2 where the key informant said, we can actually go to a funder and say, this is what we should be looking at. That's at the level of agenda setting, but then even at the level of partnerships between high income countries and low and middle income countries, that, there was commentary on how the power dynamics are not necessarily put under the microscope, and that researchers from the low and middle income countries have become very wary of how they enter into those partnerships, because often they become the partners to a project. They involve mainly in terms of providing access to local respondents and so on, but left out of key decision-making processes and so on. I mean, your question was largely around concepts and so on. And I mean, that for sure is also a key issue. Concepts, but even at the fundamental level of language being a barrier, and which is why it's great that this platform today is, that it's been translated in many different languages, because at the level of funders putting out a call for research proposals, someone, our key informer said that they might well have a good idea, but it's not best articulated in English. So I'm going to stop there.
Okay, great, thank you. And there's another question here, but I think actually, Madhoni, you had addressed Fabio's question on a lot of aspects of this. What needs to change specifically in regards to advocacy by global North actors, and all of this. So I'm going to move on. And Fabio, if you feel there's an aspect of this that hasn't been addressed and you want to pop something else in the box, please do. And then there's a question from Nwabisa saying, I'm struck by Joe's presentation on engaging knowledge-based practitioners with researchers and funders. There's a group that's left out, local practitioners whose work is not clearly informed by research and for whom there's limited adoption or buy-in on delivering prevention evidence, knowledge informed, not from lack of interest, but perhaps lack of understanding. The question is, how can these types of practitioners benefit from decolonized funding and even use decolonized knowledge production in a context and in ways that help them address their local needs and realities? I'm going to open that up to anyone who'd like to jump in there. Liz, yes, go ahead.
So, I mean, thanks, Moby. So it's a really important and it's a great question. And it goes back to, I think, what Tess was talking about, around the importance of evidence hierarchies and, that there are different types of evidence, and each piece of evidence is very important to building our understanding of how to respond and inform the, prevention and response programs. And what we're learning through this process is that we need to be working closely with practitioners and researchers and policymakers to ensure that the research questions are firmly rooted in the local context, and that practitioners have really important knowledge that needs to be fed into the process, because often practitioner knowledge can outpace research knowledge. Research can be a very slow process. And so how do we ensure that practitioner voices are firmly centered in the work that we're doing? And how do we provide support for practitioners to be strengthening the way in which that they're using the monitoring and evaluation work to inform and strengthen their own programs, but also to be partnering with researchers, organizations to strengthen the evidence base more broadly. And I think that, for example, in the SVRI Forum, we are providing opportunities and spaces for practitioners to be sharing the knowledge and the learnings that they are creating through their work and their M&E systems. And I think it's really important for us as a field to challenge those hierarchies, to acknowledge that every different type of information is important and has a space and a place. We don't quite know how to be thinking through ensuring practitioner-based knowledge comes into the evidence building processes to inform policies and programs. And we really, as a group, need to be having those conversations. But I also think that evidence has to represent, the perspectives of those with the lived experiences of the services and the prevention programs that we're trying to build and create. And if we don't do that, we aren't going to, succeed in ending violence against women and providing, quality services. So I think we really need to disrupt the way in which we're working, the types of ways we're doing research. And to go back to Lindsay's questions around the different methodologies and tools and approaches, we really need to engage with different types of knowledges and Indigenous knowledges and different Indigenous methods and processes as well, to ensure that we're not just using, sort of like a northern-based frame for the way in which we're developing knowledge. Aisha, I'm going to stop there and hand back to you.
Okay, great.
And Wabi, I hope I've answered your question.
And I think that's it actually for the questions. And we literally do have only 4 minutes left in the session. So what I'd like to say is thank you so very much to our panelists, because this has been a really fascinating discussion. And thank you for being with us and bringing all this incredible expertise and knowledge into this panel with us. And if nobody minds, I'd like to just launch a quick poll for all our participants with just 3 questions, which we'd love you to answer. And yeah, we'd love to look at. And once that's done, I'm going to hand over to Liz to close the session. So, Moma, can you launch the poll, please? Brilliant. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see it and do it. We'll just spend 1 minute on this.
I realize that we're not allowed to vote.
No.
Right, we can't vote. This way we'd be like, extremely useful, brilliant. Bias.
Acknowledging bias. Thank you, Morma, for keeping us real.
Yeah.
Trying to click on extremely useful.
There's 3 questions. Okay, yeah, I think most people have done it. I'm going to give 20 more seconds for this. And I say things like 10 more seconds, 20 more seconds, but I actually have no idea. And then I completely lose track of the time. Okay, I think we'll end the poll now and share the results. Oh, okay, maybe not. Okay, thanks everyone so much for doing that with us. And yeah, again, thank you so much. Over to you, Liz.
Well, I did see the poll findings, and I love the fact that people are feeling optimistic, and it is important. But I want to echo Aisha's words of thanks to you all, to the panelists. It's been wonderful for you as participants for engaging with us and being on this journey, because many of you have been on the journey in developing these resources with us. And Morma for being a wonderful producer, so thank you as well. And Tesma and Mathoni for joining us to bring your insights into what our understandings on how we can be decolonising research on violence against women in low middle income countries. But without the commitment of the field to building better funding and resources for research on violence against women, these resources would not exist. And to note, I just wanted to highlight that we are seeing commitment of funders to transformation and structural change. Yeah. What we're seeing is manifesting in multiple ways, from providing funding for wellbeing, which is so important, for funding to support and the willingness to increase core funding. That's also shifting and changing. So that's really important. And I think so people are hearing women's rights organizations and researchers in low middle income countries on what's important. And also providing more flexible funding options and creating new types of funding mechanisms, I think, are being built, which I think is so important for the field. And I really love, as a recipient of funding, is that the commitment to reducing an administrative burden placed on grantees. Thank you for that. And we love that idea. And we are also learning and trying to do that with our own own partners. And I think we're really seeing a willingness and openness to participate in discussions on this issue like today. And so that's for what we're really grateful. Both like today, these discussions, and with their partners beyond other funders, because often in the past funders have spoken only to other funders. So these types of discussions are really important. So I think there are many reasons for hope. And I think even though change is slow, it is slow, and that's okay, but we are seeing change. But I think this in particular, this time is such an important moment, a moment where that we all need to grab hold of and use to continue to advocate for change and find the allies to work with us in doing so. And so on that note, I'm going to say thank you again and hand back to Aisha to close the session.
The session is closed. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you.
And goodbye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.